So as Sandy said, I'm Trent Alexander. I'm the Associate Director here at ICPSR. And my collaborator in all this work is Katie Genetic, who is an economist at the Census Bureau. And what I'm going to talk about here, I'm not going to talk about all longitudinal data relating to the United States. This is actually pretty focused on a project that I hope, in the next, call it 5 to 10 years, we'll make all possible links between the 1850 census all the way forward through the 2020 census. So this is an effort to link complete population censuses over time and make them available for research. Okay? So what I'm going to talk about, it's not so much an introduction, but I think it sort of shows you where we're coming from. I'm going to talk about both Katie's and my background. We have a similar background. Both of us worked for 10 years at the Minnesota Population Center on the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series projects there. I left there to work at the Census Bureau for 7 years, and Katie is now at the Census Bureau. So we both have that sort of lineage, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that's influenced our approach to doing this work. And then you can see I'm going to walk you through the infrastructure that we're in the process of building, why the Census Bureau is the right place to be doing this, and what's out there and who's using it, and what we're going to do next, okay? And just, I know we started a teeny bit late. My plan is to talk for maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes, take whatever questions there are. So I do not think we'll go till 9. That's my plan. Okay, so I'm a historian, as Sandy said. And my PhD is from Carnegie Mellon University. I was at Carnegie Mellon in the 90s. This wasn't my computer, but it may as well have been. This was actually a lot nicer than the one I used. I did use reel-to-reel tapes from ICPSR to do my dissertation. I got census public use microdata delivered to Carnegie Mellon, and I didn't have such a sweet setup where I could load the tape myself. They went to a central facility where I would send, in a Unix window, a mount command, and then call someone and say, I sent a mount command, and he would, go and mount a tape. And then I would have to read from it. I had the great honor as a graduate student, I think I was the only one I was aware of who had 5 gigabytes of storage available for a short time. It was a big deal. So times were tough, but really it wasn't computers that made the work really hard. The computers were actually sufficient. With 5 gigabytes, I could load what I needed from a microdata sample and do my analysis. I had to do it at night, but it was okay. The problem was more kind of the same problem I'm sure you guys encounter today. And this is a big problem that ICPSR works on, and that is the documentation. I was using multiple census samples. I wasn't linking them, but I was doing cross-sectional work on migration, looking at how migrants' experiences changed over time. This is a stack of code books from the different decennial census microdata samples that were available at that time. Every sample had its own layout. The variables had different names from sample to sample for no good reason. They had different coding schemes. So in this sample, for the sex variable, male was 1, female was 2. In this one, male was 0, female was 1. And you had to, if you were going to use multiple samples at once, you had to do all that work of integrating it. And it's just grunt work, but it's very, very detailed grunt work that can really mess up your analysis if you don't do it carefully. And that was the cost of admission in those days. All of us were doing it on our own. Some of us were making mistakes, some of us were making different choices, and that affected the science. This was really influenced me. And in the course of doing my dissertation, when I was about halfway through, this product had its first appearance on the scene. I don't know if people have heard of this. IPUM stands for Integrated Public Use Microdata Series. This was made by historians initially at the University of Minnesota, where I went for my postdoc when I finished. They did all that work that I was talking about. They integrated variable names, variable codes. All the documentation was on the web. The web was brand new. This was like, actually, the first version of it, it was a PDF that you could order. It was like 2,000 pages, and I ordered it. I mean, I had to. So this was kind of the initial vision that, hey, we have all these samples. At that time, there weren't that many. They didn't have every census from 1850 through the present. The coverage was a little bit spotty, but what they had, they integrated. So you could use them all over time, easily, without doing that grunt work yourself, because someone really smart and dedicated, I call it grunt work, but trust me, I have the greatest respect for this work. It's what I did for 10 years after I got my PhD. So this is, I don't mean to suggest it's not important. I think it's extremely important. But it's important that it be done well, and preferably once. Not that every researcher should have to do it. That's what they did, and I loved it. So they initially did it for census data, US Census data. When a sample wasn't available, they made one. We had data entry operators in Minnesota typing in census data all day, for decades. They still are. That's what IPMS USA was. And this idea that data should be integrated, really easy to get, easy to use, that documentation preparation work should be, as much as possible, done by one group and then used by others. That model flowed to the current population survey and to all these other products you can see here. This is all free. It's all funded by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. So this is where I was for 10 years, this idea that we needed samples, microdata samples from every census. They needed to be easy to get and use. That's what I was doing, and that was the mission for a long time. It was hard. And for IPMS International, whoops, what happened there? For a lot of these, the samples weren't even, so I showed you the stack of code books. That was data that was available. It was just hard to use. But a lot of this, it wasn't available. The data was, almost every country conducts a census almost every 5 or 10 years and has done so for a very long time. They had the microdata. Countries all around the world have the microdata. And IPMS went, the staff from University of Minnesota went country to country, making deals with statistical agencies, getting the microdata and disseminating it in the same way. So this is hundreds of censuses from dozens of countries around the world now. And I think what I want to try to convey with all this work is that it's not just a technical problem. There's sort of an ingenuity component. This is like data recovery, data archaeology. And the record linkage I'm going to talk about, it's not, at least from my perspective, I'm a historian, it's not just a math problem. It's not just like, oh, what algorithm do I need to do that link right? It's much more about knowing the data, clever use of the data, bringing in ancillary data to make the link, and I'll tell you more about what I mean there. So for IPMS International, this is some pictures. I didn't take these pictures. This was a really big team. I was focused on the USA projects, but they literally went around country to country, first making the deal with the statistical agency, then getting the data. It was often like this. This is not data that was sitting on computers, like at Carnegie Mellon in the 90s. This is often in piles in dusty rooms. This is the Sudanese census of 1973, I believe, which was shipped back to Mueller Media in New York City and recovered. This is one of the Bangladeshi censuses. I'm not sure you can see the tape is moldy. Also, this is recovered. It's publicly available now. And this, lest any of us from the United States get too comfortable in the fact that maybe this is just a problem that the rest of the world has. This is a picture I took. This was a project that I ran to recover the 1960 United States Census. When I was at Minnesota, we asked the Census Bureau. They had made public use samples available for each of the censuses from 1960 forward. We said, well, can people have access to the full confidential microdata in your research data centers? And this is, I say we, there was a Minnesota grad who was working at the Census Bureau, so this was his ask. And they said, oh gosh, that's stored in what they called the vault. We'll have to see if it's recoverable. 1970 was, 1980 was, 1960 was not. It looked, parts of it, a lot like that. So this was the same thing. At the same time, we had people going all around the world trying to recover data. The same thing was happening in the United States. For the 1960 census, the original microfilm that the census was on are stored in a cave in Lenexa, Kansas. That's what this is. That's me before I'm going into the cave for the first time. And it was fascinating. So I'll show you. That's what the entrance to the cave looks like. There's just this is a National Archives facility. There's all kinds of really interesting stuff back in there, including the entire 1960 census on microfilm. So for this project, this is how it was originally digitized. In 1960, they first put the census, they filmed the paper. There's a paper census that people filled out. And they put it on film, and then they ran that film through this thing called the Fosdick machine. That was a mechanical device. This wasn't a computer. And this shined light through the bubbles. It was a bubble form. It shined light through the bubbles and tabulated the data in that way. It was actually really fast and really efficient. We made ourselves a digital Fosdick machine to recover the 1960 data. This is down in the cave. You can tell the left half of there, that's unfinished cave wall. That's the space they gave us to do this work in. And that thing on the left is a digital film scanner. That was creating digital images. That server on the right was processing those images, trying to turn it into data. This worked. We now have a 1960 microdata file, although it was slower and less accurate than the mechanical device. We actually, once we realized that it was a little slower and a little less accurate, we tried to get a Fosdick machine. They had just surplused, just thrown away the very last one. So it would have been cool to actually reuse the Fosdick machine, but no such luck. So we used a computer. Okay, so that's the background. In 2010, I went to the Census Bureau where I managed all the data in the Research Data Center network. So this is how the Census Bureau offers confidential data to researchers around the country. It's got 30 locations. There's one here at the University of Michigan. These are secure rooms where, after you go through a background check and your project is approved, you can sit there and work on confidential census data. I managed the data in that network at the Census Bureau. And it was there that I became aware of work the census was already doing, linking these files over time. So I want to emphasize this wasn't something I invented. This was happening at the Census Bureau already, and I'll talk a little more about that. But there's a lot more of it happening now. Okay. Now, this is happening not just in the Census Bureau with confidential data. This is also, I'm sure as some of you know, happening out there with already public census data too. So I want to talk about that for a minute. I'm a historian, as I said. This is pretty important to my discipline. Census data is held confidential for 72 years, and then it's released. So a lot of it's already been released. Data through the 1940 census is fully public, and people are linking it like crazy, and have been for a long time. Linking it to other sources, but also linking it from census to census over time. It's all public. This was kind of the foundation of my field of social history, where people would take little samples, like a little group of Bostonians, and try to find them. They would, from the 1850 census, and try to find them in 1860, and then if you found some there, try to find them in 1870. This was often by hand, and you would just find whoever you could and write your dissertation or your book. This was done on a really large scale in the 80s for the whole city of Philadelphia over the 19th century. That was called the Philadelphia Social History Project. Very big deal. But really, just one city. If people left Philadelphia, we lost them. If they stayed in Philadelphia, we had a pretty good shot at folding them over time. That's the history of this work. The linkage rates were extraordinarily low. Between two censuses, maybe you'd link 10% of the population from one census to the other. Or, if you were really clever, you would focus on easily linkable groups, so you could automate it a little more. What I mean is like married couples. So you've got more to deal with in terms of following people over time. If you're just looking, we don't have many linkage keys in historical census data. You've got name, age, not date of birth, age, state of birth, and sex. That's it. So if you're from the US, ask yourself, is there anybody else who was born in the state I was born in with my name and my age? Probably. If so, you're a failed link. You would not be in this data. So people would get clever and say, well, I'll just look at married couples, and that's great. That works better because you have those two names to link on, and you can try to see them in different censuses. But it means your paper is going to be on married couples. That might not be what you want to study. So we had low linkage rates, targeting easily linkable groups. Oh, by the way, if you want to link unmarried women, or women who aren't previous, any sort of girl that you want to follow forward as she becomes a woman, no way. Because women's names changed in the 19th century. There was no good data following women over time. So this is a big issue. There have been two major innovations in this kind of linkage, because it's happening now more than ever. So linking these historical decennial censuses. One, the people mostly at the University of Minnesota have partnered with genealogy companies who have entered all the information from all the censuses from 1790 through 1940. Complete data set. And they sell it. It's proprietary. You pay access to Ancestry.com and you can look up your ancestors. But if you want a data set, Minnesota brokered a deal on behalf of all researchers where you can get it for research purposes. So in addition to essentially liberating this huge resource, again, remember I said like in the 2000s we were paying people to type that data in. That's kind of obsolete now because we have everything, because it was typed in by genealogy companies. So that's making a huge difference. The other thing that's making a huge difference is the use of vital records, birth records, death records, marriage records. If you're just linking one census to another, even though you have all the data, you're going to get those low linkage rates because there's going to be someone else with your name and your age and your state of birth, probably, and it's going to be hard to figure out who's you, and the linkage will be uncertain. But with vital records, with your birth record that says not only your name, but what your parents' names were, and your marriage record that says not only your name, but what your parents' names were, and your death record, which sometimes includes that information. There's just a lot more linkage keys to figure out who's who, to see when women's names change, and to follow people over time much more effectively. So this field is going gangbusters right now, and I would say with a couple of new grants that are going on that just started, we have a good shot, I think, in the next 5 years of having many, many millions of links, not just for married couples or people in Philadelphia, but for the whole population over this period. This work is ongoing, and some of it's here at Michigan. Any questions yet? Okay. So the other stuff that's happening is that the Census Bureau is pretty different, really. This is happening with restricted data. None of this is public yet. You can use it in research data centers or at the Census Bureau. And the linkage strategies are pretty similar. The census doesn't have any tricks that the rest of the world doesn't know. Everyone uses the same sort of string comparators and linkage techniques. But what they have is much richer source data. So beginning in the 1940s, for instance, we have everyone who applied for a Social Security number, and most people did. We have, it's an additional source where when they applied, they reported their parents' names and their state of birth and their exact date of birth. So it's sort of that alone, the Social Security database, functions a lot like the vital records are in the 19th century, where it just provides this whole new set of linkage keys where you can see, you can find people much more easily, and you get much, much higher linkage rates than those old censuses where we were getting like 10%. And I'll get into, in just a minute, an example of that so it makes a little more sense. But basically, super high linkage rates at the census, close to 90%. I'll show you. However, until very recently, all of this linked data, I shouldn't say that, most of this linked data was being used in the service of the Census Bureau's agency goals. They weren't doing this for social research. They were doing this to carry out their mission more effectively. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a sec. So the Census Bureau has data from all over the place. And not every federal agency can say that. The census has kind of a unique law that allows them to get full personally identified data from whoever they can. They don't have authority to say, give me data, I'm the Census Bureau, except on the census form. But when they want data sets in service of their mission, they can ask whoever they want for a full PII, full personally identifiable data set. And that's stated in their law. So it's not some trick, it's actually kind of a requirement of their law that they can call upon any other department, agency, or establishment of the federal government from states, counties, or cities. The secretary, that's the Secretary of Commerce. Census is in the Commerce Department. The secretary shall, not may or could, or if he wants to, can, shall, acquire and use information available from any of these sources instead of conducting direct inquiries. So basically, it's part of their mission. If that information is available somewhere else and they can get it and avoid asking you the question, they have to. That's what the law says. So that's why they're out there getting data from everywhere and linking it to everything. It's not, or at least it wasn't originally, so they could make cool articles. It was so they could reduce the burden on the people of all the questions. Okay, so they have a really rich, advanced record linkage infrastructure. They use this to improve surveys, to add values, to add variables to surveys, and to make new data products, and increasingly to support social research. This is just a sample of all the data that is held at the Census Bureau. Tax data, public housing data, public housing subsidies, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Veterans Administration, Postal Service, they have data from everywhere. And the reason is because it allows them to reduce the burden on the public. So to use this data, linkage is really critical. If they've been out in the field asking you questions, like they will on the 2020 census, if they want to enrich that data, they're going to have to do so with all those other sources that I showed you. They do so through record linkage, and they have been doing that for quite a while. Here's how they do it. They assign something called a protected identification key. This is basically an SSN. It's a social security number. It's a one-to-one with a social security number. We don't ask on any census survey, including the decennial census, what your social security number is. So this is probabilistically determined using your name and your date of birth and your address. Okay. They use this not only to link things, to bring in other data and make cool new products without having to increase the burden on you, but also to unduplicate. So meaning, if you fill out the 2020 census more than once, or if you fill it out and your wife fills it out, or if you fill it out for your kid who's at college and he fills it out at college, they have to figure that out. Nobody tells them. They use record linkage to figure that out. They try to link records within a single file, within the census. So this is really important to their mission. PIC data can PIC, protected identification key. PIC data can be linked to any other PIC data. That means every file that I'm in, if I'm picked correctly, and if my PIC is 1, let's say I'm 1, you're 2, you're 3, I'll be 1 in every single file. So it's a persistent identifier, where any file that runs through this process, if I'm in it, I'll get assigned a 1 if we do it correctly. So here's one really important innovation of how they do work. When they want to link the 2000 and 2010 censuses, they don't try to link them to each other. They link each thing to this big file made up of all those files I showed you on the screen with tax data, Medicare, Medicaid, called the reference file. So basically, everyone who's ever been observed in government administrative processes becomes a part of this reference file. They're always trying to link to that. That has data from, the base of it is an SSN. To be in that file, you must have a social security number. And from there, it just builds out variables. Every variable they observe for that social security number becomes a part of the reference file. And then every file that they want to pick, that they want to assign a linkage key to, they try to link to that file. The most powerful variable in this file is street address, particularly for Medicare records. Medicare is the social medicine program for people who are 65 and over, and tax data, tax returns. So they know each year, if you're in Medicare or tax data, exactly where you live. And if you're surveyed in a census survey, or if you're in the 2020 census, they also know where you live. It's that address level link that is the most powerful variable in assigning SSNs, social security numbers, to cases. They also use some sort of standard record linkage techniques of allowing for common name variations, Joseph and Joe, standardizing names when possible, standardizing addresses when possible. So this is all standard stuff, and they do it well. But it's not really the secret sauce. The secret sauce, why their record linkage is so much better than what's happening out here, outside census walls, is the use of this reference file. Very, very powerful. All right, I think I won't spend too much time on this. This has to do with the way they link. Basically, the 2010 census had 320 million people in it. The reference file has 600 million records in it. You can't compare all 320 million records to all 600 million records. They can't. They don't have computers that are good enough for that right now. So they reduce the comparison space in different ways. That's what this is referring to. This is to simplify the computation. It's standard in record linkage. I'd be happy to talk about it more if people want to hear more about it. What this shows, is that the variable that they block on, that is the variable that they privilege when they're doing record linkage, because they're not comparing every case to every case. It's too much work. The one that's most effective, and say the Medicare data, when that was picked, it's all about the SSN. What they do is compare the SSN they observe in Medicare to the SSN from the reference file, make sure the name and the date of birth match. When they do, it's good. That's a match. And it works all the time, almost. With the census data, however, there's no SSN. So there, with their matching, they start with street address. And they say, OK, we have the census street address. We have street address in our annual reference file, so they have one from 2010. Then they compare the name, date of birth. That almost always worked in the 2010 census. But when it didn't, they had some other strategies they could try that also worked. OK, so this is very successful. I told you historical linkage rates were somewhere around 10%, maybe 15 if you really widen the parameters and allowed some kind of fuzzy, loose links. These are closer to 90% linkage rates. OK, pick rates. Pick rates are high. It's a good thing. Are they accurate? The takeaway from this slide is, yeah, when there's a pick, it's almost always right. They're not wrong. And the way this was done was with Medicare data, we have a ton of variables plus SSN. So first we picked it with Social Security number. Then we hid that from ourselves and repicked it with everything else and did a comparison. And lo and behold, it's almost always the same thing. We almost always get the same result, whether or not we use the Social Security number in the picking. But you can see there are some error rates. These are much, much lower error rates than you see in historical data, but there's some error. The much bigger problem is, I told you we only pick people, we only link people who have Social Security numbers. Yet a lot of people don't have those. They don't get linked. That's who's in that 10% that aren't linked. So there's not much error in this data, but there's bias, absolutely. Those are groups we pick extraordinarily well. If you're in the tax records, if you're in Medicare, it's going to be good. We're going to make that link. If you're a child who's not on a tax form, if you're a resident without an SSN, if you're mobile, so you're, as I said, we rely on address. Address is really key. If you move around a lot, if you're homeless, your address is not going to be very reliable, and our link is not going to be very strong. So here's how this looks. There's kind of a lot of information here. Here's the takeaway. It's not just those population subgroups that have representation issues. This nets a geographic representation problem. Those purple areas in the middle, this is where when we matched the 2010 census to the reference file, to administrative records, very, very high match rates. People who filled out census forms in the upper Midwest, like around here, are in the administrative records too. Very pickable, very linkable. Down here, on the border, much less linkable. And that's because these people aren't represented in administrative records, much less likely to have SSNs. And you can see, even down here, the linkage rates aren't minuscule. They're still 80%, which any historian I know would kill for. These are very good rates, but there's a representation issue that anyone who uses these data has to be aware of. My clicker go, oh, there it is. Okay, I think I'm going too slow. I'm going to move a little faster and skip a couple things. Okay, so here's what we had up until a few years ago. As I said, the Census Bureau has been doing this for a while. It's how they do their work. And for 2000 census, 2010 census, for the American Community Survey, which is about a 1.7% survey of the population that happens every year, those have been linkable to each other since they were conducted. All of these census surveys and administrative records, this has all been sitting there. It's increasingly being used for research. What my team brought to the table was the 1940 census, which we got through agreement with Ancestry.com, facilitated by the University of Minnesota. So we got it from Minnesota after they had an agreement with Ancestry. So the census never had this. A fully digitized 1940 census, they never had that. But genealogical companies digitized it, and then it came to Census, integrated into this infrastructure. That's what the 1940 census looked like, all typed in. Let's see. Oh, look at that. So these are pretty standard historical linkage keys. You normally might have expected a linkage rate of 10 to 15%, except for children, because the census is a household survey, they're living with their parents, so we have parents' names with children. Parents' names inside the census walls, very powerful linkage tool, because we also have parents' names when you apply for a Social Security number. So we got much higher linkage rates with 1940 than we necessarily expected. This is what the linkage rates look like by age. We did great with kids because we have their parents' names. Overall, we got about 70% of kids. And in the whole 1940 census, somewhere around 40% of the population can be linked forward to the 2000, they received PICs. There were 130 million people in the United States in 1940. You can see 53 million of them we assigned PICs to. About half of those can be linked forward to 2000. A little less to 2010, and then some to the American Community Survey. Okay, so 1940 is great. That's in the infrastructure. People are using it for research. The problem with 1950 through 1990, which are also private data, is that we don't have names. So I told you the Census Bureau did recover the microdata, but they never entered the names for these censuses. They didn't need them. So those exist only on the microfilm in that cave in Kansas. So we're trying to get them. It's kind of hard. But I think that where we're headed, I think in the next 5 years, is I think we'll have 1990, which we'll have to, I don't think we're actually going to have to recover the names from 1990. We figured something else out. And we'll have 1850 through 1930. So I think in the next 5 years, we'll have an almost complete infrastructure of decennial censuses linked over time and available for research, and linked to modern administrative records and surveys. This will be a very, very powerful tool. I think it'll change social science, actually. Okay, I'm not going to talk in too much detail about 1990, but basically, when I was there in 2015 and 2016, we conducted a pilot to recover names from the 1990 census so that we could link it into this infrastructure. The pilot was successful. We are able to recover the names using optical character recognition. So first we digitized the forms using that machine I showed you before, and then we run those forms through optical character recognition, and the accuracy is pretty decent. Good enough. The reason it's good enough is because in the course of this work, we also found a complete address list from the 1990 census, and I've told you how important address is. We have tax data from 1990, where it's got everybody with their street addresses. We have census data from 1990, where it's got everybody with their street addresses. We don't have names from the 1990 census, because this was just a pilot. I actually don't think we need names. I think with the address level link, we can verify the match using variables that we have. Okay. That won't work for the other years. They're going to be expensive, but we'll see. So I've got some pictures. I'm going to kind of move quickly through these. This is a 1990 census form. These are handwritten by me, because this is confidential data still. And that's what we recovered, and it worked pretty well. We used a bunch of different scanners. We typed in truth data. That's what our optical handwriting recognition system looked like. And we got perfect matches about 70% of the time, which is really good. We got close matches a much higher percentage of the time. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is how people get this data. I told you they get it in the Research Data Center Network, which is 30 locations around the country. My collaborator, Katie, works at the one in Boulder. And I started a project called the Census Longitudinal Infrastructure Project that provided access to researchers to these linked data. Katie runs that project now. This is a Census Bureau project with the goal of adding more old data to this linked infrastructure. So that's why we're working on 1990 and doing additional testing on how to recover names from the earlier years, and providing access to this data in research data centers, and creating new statistics without increased burden to respondents. So this is essentially another way for the Bureau to fulfill its mission of getting more data out the door without asking you any more questions. They don't have to ask you, where did your mother live in 1940? We can determine that without asking you. Okay. So this project started in 2014, and the researchers had the first article out in 2016. There are 9 projects. I'm not going to walk through all those, but I'll tell you a little bit about the first 2. This is a project that's doing social mobility. They actually brought in data from an earlier census and linked it forward. So you can see it starts at 1910. Their first working paper had a really big impact. This is in Wonk Blog in the Washington Post. So this was research that could not have been done without individually linked census data. Project number 2, there are 9. Project number 2 is actually mine. That's my name right there. We just published our first article in Demography in December, where we looked at the children of African Americans who moved north in the first half of the 20th century. We observed them when they were young children in 1940, and then looked at them again in 2000 when they were retirement age. And so that's how we studied second generation outcomes in the Great Migration, and that got some good press too. So these are the first 2 projects, and the research is coming out, and I think there's really going to be quite a bit you can do with this data that there's no other way to do. All right, just another minute here. So what's happening? We're in this pilot phase right now where we have 9 projects doing research, demonstrating the value of this work to the Census Bureau. And beginning just this month, the Census has encouraged a larger number of researchers to apply for access to do this kind of work, which is a very good thing. There'll be hurdles. There's hurdles to get any of this restricted data. And to get this data, there's an additional hurdle where you have to appear before a policy committee at the Census Bureau and demonstrate that the project will be of value to the agency. In terms of data, another genealogy company has typed in the 1940 census. We believe with even a higher degree of accuracy, particularly on the name variable, we're bringing that data into the Census Bureau. So we think we'll have an even better version of 1940 linked data. There's historical tax data from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that is recovered and should really facilitate this record linkage because it has address. And as I said, we're looking for ways to recover names from those other files more cheaply so that we can link them. And that stuff happening at Minnesota and at Michigan is really happening. They're going to be done in a few years. And we're going to have a very long run of linked decennial census data. These are some other goals for the next few years. We want public metadata for all these products so you can plan your study effectively. And helpful data processing tools. That's all I have to say.